When the COVID pandemic hit, it triggered a tsunami of spending by the government, trillions of taxpayer dollars.
We conservatively estimated that $200 billion in potential fraud existed in these programs.
That's shocking.
And we'll give you some of the shocking examples of who profited at taxpayer expense. This week, Full Measure follows the money on a boondoggle big even by Washington standards.
Police Department, search warrant! Police Department, search warrant!
When a police tactical team goes in, it's supposed to be a display of overwhelming force against a dangerous threat. But what if there is no threat?
They called me to tell me that somebody was in my house, they're holding hostage, and then I said, okay, we're not there.
A U.S. senator had been swatted, a fake call to police to send an armed team. It's a dangerous and growing prank. We look at the disturbing cause.
The organized swatting, which has common themes, may have a root in politics.
And we take a look at what may be one long-ignored cause behind the #1 cancer in women.
Never heard about the breast cancer virus. And when I first became aware of it, I was like, you got to be kidding me.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. When COVID happened, the U.S. health response may have left something to be desired. But one thing our public officials turned out to be very good at was rushing taxpayer money out the door without proper oversight. More than $6 trillion in COVID funds poured into the economy, a lot of it relief funds for small businesses. We're now learning the eye-popping scope of the fraud committed as the hunt continues to catch more of the crooks. In today's cover story, we follow the COVID money.
Mike Ware is the Inspector General at the Small Business Administration, or SBA. The SBA paid out the COVID relief funds intended for small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, EIDL, most of it distributed through banks.
We conservatively estimated that $200 billion in potential fraud existed in these programs.
That's shocking. That, I think your report said, means at least 17% of the funds were dispersed to potentially fraudulent actors, more than $136 billion in EIDLs and $64 billion in PPP. So 17%, that's unacceptably high, isn't it, for fraud?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you that it is, especially when you're talking about $200 billion.
How do you find out about most of your fraud cases?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Initially, we had incredible partnerships off the bat with the banks. The banks, of course, have their own internal control structure set up and their own investigations divisions within the banks. And off the bat, we had like 5,000 complaints in a week. Off the bat, you have a problem.
What were the kinds of things the banks were saying?
Oh, these folks don't own a business. They never owned a business before. They don't
Which
know
they
where
have
the
to
money's
have a
coming
business
from.
to get obviously a loan to help their small
Yes.
business.
Yes.
Let's talk about a couple of the notable cases. One, I guess, was profiled in a TV show, American Greed.
Oh, I know the case. Mm-hmm.
Where it said 8 people submitted at least 150 fraudulent loan applications and got $18 million.
Richard Ovarian runs a family fraud factory designed to steal millions in COVID cash to spend on houses, watches, and gold.
A couple of things stood out on this case. One of them was we found duffel bags full of money buried in the backyard. So that was one. Secondly, once they were arrested, they were home waiting for sentencing with monitors, home monitoring, home arrest, and they fled the country. And with the FBI, we were able to apprehend them in Montenegro as they were trying a border crossing and brought them back.
The group, including this married couple, managed to get its hands on over $18 million in taxpayer money. They splurged on luxury homes, gold coins, diamonds, jewelry, watches, fine furnishings, designer handbags, clothes, and a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Many of the cases top $1 million and involve criminals submitting fraudulent loan applications for fake businesses to pay non-existent employees. Former NFL player Joshua Bellamy got 3 years in prison for a $1.2 million scam. He admitted spending it on jewelry and at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino. Lee Price III got 9 years in prison for stealing $1.6 million in relief funds and buying a Lamborghini, a Ford F-350, and a Rolex. Reality star Maurice Fain of Love and Hip Hop Atlanta got 17 and a half years in prison for a fraudulent $3.7 million COVID relief loan. Prosecutors say he used it on his extravagant lifestyle and to buy custom-made jewelry and lease a Rolls-Royce. Mustafa Kadiri got 4.5 years in prison for cheating taxpayers out of $5 million and buying personal items including Ferrari, Bentley, and Lamborghini cars. 30 people took part in a $9.2 million scheme led by Sherry Joseph, who committed the crime on pre-trial release for separate fraud charges. Baby Blue of the hip-hop group Pretty Ricky was convicted in a $24 million con, released early after serving 1 year of a 20-year sentence. Amir Akil got 15 years in prison for leading a fraud ring involving at least 14 others and more than $35 million. And then there are violent gangs that apparently figured out COVID relief funds were easier money than the typical street hustle. In Puerto Rico, 111 gang members have been arrested so far in COVID relief scams amounting to more than $9 million. And in Charleston, South Carolina, these suspects are among dozens arrested in Operation Trendsetter, where investigators caught members of the gang Sex Money Murder taking part in a racket that involved submitting fraudulent COVID relief applications.
Where, of course, they were being investigated for all manner of crimes. But it was so much easier during the pandemic to attack SBA's pandemic programs. You're not going to be shot at behind a computer, I would assume. And we were able to use our link analysis techniques to arrest over 36 gang members and bring them in.
In all, the Small Business Administration puts the potential fraud at $200 billion, involving 4.5 million loans and grants. There have been more than 1,000 arrests so far and $41 billion in fines, forfeitures, and other return money.
What happens to the money that you've been able to claw back? Where does that go?
It goes back to the Treasury.
It looks like Ware's team at the Small Business Administration Inspector General's office is going to stay busy for a long time. The agency recently got a 10-year extension on the time limit to go after the crimes.
I would say the number one thing that I have learned through all this is that the government needs a blueprint for standing up any emergency program. Really, they need a blueprint for standing up any program that requires the internal control environment to be seriously considered prior to a single dollar going through the door.
Because when an emergency happens, typically a program starts up, Congress appropriates money, it flows out the door without many controls, and then inevitably we find a lot of it was misspent.
Correct.
But you're saying on the front end there could be sort of a standing way of operating, so there would be controls on the front end?
This is true, but to be honest, why don't we have that? This should be in place for any program.
Ware says the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee that he serves on hopes to create a blueprint for federal agencies to use in the future with processes for upfront controls before emergency funds go out the door. When we come back, what's swatting and why is it a growing concern? You've heard of police SWAT teams. SWAT stands for Special Weapons and Tactics, by the way. Today, authorities are trying to combat a crime that's being called swatting. It's when somebody falsely reports an emergency at somebody else's house to embarrass or inconvenience the victim, or even bring him into a potentially violent confrontation with police. Lisa Fletcher reports more states are trying to combat the problem.
And then if you
Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott is no stranger to controversy, criticism, and even threats.
I can't wait to get to work. Thank you for this great honor.
Before coming to Washington, he spent 8 years as the Sunshine State's governor. But last Christmas, he and his family faced something new.
Breaking news tonight, Naples police responded to a report of a shooting at the home of Senator Rick Scott.
A caller to Naples police reported a shooting at the senator's home. Police responded, but also called Senator Scott directly to find out what was going on.
Usually I'm home by then, but we hadn't gotten home that night, so they called me to tell me that somebody was in my house. They're holding hostage, and so because the law enforcement knew me, they could call me on my cell. And then I said, okay, we're not there.
It was a swatting call. There was no...
Scott and his family had been swatted. Someone reported a fake emergency, hoping to trigger a SWAT team response.
You were immediately suspicious.
Oh, yeah, it didn't make any sense. Now, fortunately, we weren't there. But if we'd been in the house and they couldn't gotten a hold of me, then I would had somebody break into my house that I have no idea who they are. But their goal was that I would be harmed, my wife would be harmed, or law enforcement would be harmed.
Just a few days before the incident at Senator Scott's home, Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene was swatted. On Christmas Day, police came to her home after someone falsely claimed a man had shot someone at Greene's house. Greene wrote on X that she and her family had been targeted numerous times.
Police department, search warrant! Police department, search warrant!
The danger from false calls is that responding police use lethal force when there's no emergency. That happened in 2017 when a Los Angeles man called police in Kansas and claimed there had been a shooting at a house in Wichita. Officers responded, and when a man who lived there but had no connection to the caller came out, he was shot by an officer who thought he had a weapon. The man later died, and 2 years later, Tyler Barris was sentenced to 20 years in prison for making the hoax call, which had been promoted by an argument over a video game.
Any sense of why there's a rise in these kind of incidents?
Well, I think some of it, quite candidly, the organized swatting which has common themes, may have a root in politics.
John McCarthy is the chief prosecutor in Montgomery County, Maryland, a wealthy suburban area of North Washington, D.C., and the backdrop for several high-profile swatting incidents, including that of special counsel Jack Smith, who is bringing a criminal case against Donald Trump.
I do think it's a measure of I think harassing individuals if their political persuasion or their role in a political issue is one that you don't agree with. So this becomes a tool to use against them.
McCarthy says swatting is not only extremely dangerous, it also exhausts strained resources. But prosecuting offenders is tough too, because many are juveniles.
It was one of the things I noticed when I was researching this story is how many of these incidents end up being a 15-year-old or a 17-year-old.
If you've got a 17, 16-year-old kid who gets involved in this because they don't want to take their math exam, and you say there's a bomb in the high school and everybody has to go home for 2 days, besides the cost of it, I think there should be more accountability than that. I think we should be looking at that in some appropriate cases, particularly when it comes to our schools, because our schools have been targeted, and more often than not, it's kids that are doing it.
Less than a year ago, Maryland became one of the latest states to pass an anti-swatting law that escalates penalties if the swatting results in injury or death. The FBI began tracking swatting cases last year. In December, they reported nearly 200 incidents over just 3 days targeting Jewish institutions. Senator Rick Scott has introduced federal legislation to target swatting specifically.
Do you know who was behind the attack on you?
No. Hopefully they'll find them. Hopefully they'll go to prison. What these people are doing is wrong. It's evil. But they want people to get harmed.
And new threats against Jewish institutions now?
Yeah, in just the last few weeks, FBI Director Christopher Wray has warned against increased threats, especially as we're heading into the Jewish Passover holiday. And that includes hoax threats, which can lead to swatting incidents.
What are some other states doing?
At least half a dozen states have passed anti-swatting laws, which raise the penalty for dangerous hoax calls made to law enforcement.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. Very interesting. And when we return, the breast cancer virus. If you've never heard of a breast cancer virus, you're not alone. Dr. Kathleen Ruddy says she wasn't taught anything about it in med school or as she became a world-recognized expert in breast cancer. Today, she says science has inexplicably dropped the ball on a fascinating and important area of research that points to a very real possibility that some breast cancer, like some cervical cancer, may be caused by a virus. Dr. Reddy is a breast cancer surgeon and author of The End of Breast Cancer, A Virus and the Hope for a Vaccine.
I discovered it years after I had finished my fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Never heard about the breast cancer virus. And when I first became aware of it, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, I did my fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I'm like a breast cancer expert. Why didn't I know about this? I'm looking at my textbooks. I'm looking in textbooks of pathology. I can find nothing about this. And I'm like, there's 100 years worth of research on the breast cancer virus? Why has this not moved forward? And that got me looking throughout the history of the whole discovery. The breast cancer virus, which was discovered in mice by John Bittner in 1936, was found to be passed in mice from mothers to their offspring, both male and female, in breast milk. It was also found to be spread by the males in sexual intercourse. Just fascinating.
Does this mean that women can catch breast cancer?
Well, that's a good question. Where do you get it? So, we know that the mice got it from their mothers, or they got it indirectly from their sexual partners. The research was headed in the direction of answering these questions. If the breast cancer virus exists in women, and there certainly seems to be compelling evidence that it does, how are women getting it? Are they getting it because they acquired it because their mothers breastfed them? Are they getting it through as sexual transmission? Are they getting it, one person, like kissing disease? How are they getting the virus? It's a question that needs to be answered. There's a lot of research that's left to do to answer the question, does a virus cause breast cancer in women? We can answer that question. If we chose to answer that question, we could answer that question.
What are the implications if a virus does cause breast cancer in women?
Well, I think there are a lot of possible interventions. One would be to screen for it. One would be to develop a proper vaccine that was properly tested and evaluated and found to be truly safe and effective.
Obviously, as you said, this should be research, but what can be done in the short term?
Nothing can be done in the short term until we complete the job of the research. There's only really one step left to complete the research. And this is how they proved that HPV causes cervical cancer, by the way. If you find that the women who became infected with the virus have an increased risk of breast cancer, that's the last step. All the other 6 steps have been done to prove that the virus causes breast cancer in women. You just need to do that. I think that the National Cancer Institute should do that. I mean, it's breast cancer, for crying out loud. It's the #1 cause of cancer in women, right? You can't break free of all of that money that you're sloshing around and spend money to answer the question, to do the last evaluation to prove that this virus causes breast cancer in women. You can't do that? You're not giving me a good reason why you can't do that.
The number of women getting diagnosed with breast cancer at some point in their lifetime is 1 in 8, according to the American Cancer Society. After a break, baby powder and ovarian cancer. An update to our reporting on alleged health risks with talcum in baby powder. In January, Johnson & Johnson tentatively agreed to pay $700 million to settle claims in 40 states. In 2017, Full Measure investigated claims that talc caused ovarian cancer in some women.
I was about 16 years old. My mother had recommended it to me because of chafing problems in the heat in the summertime.
Dean Berg was among the millions of women who used talcum powder on their genital area for freshness. Was it baby powder?
Sometimes it was baby powder, other times it was the shower to shower, because that came out and it was specifically for women. A sprinkle a day keeps the odor away.
A sprinkle a day helps keep the odor away.
And so I just thought it was perfectly safe to use, and they were marketing it quite a bit.
And how many years did this go on?
Until I got cancer when I was 49.
Even though she's a physician's assistant, Berg knew nothing about the possible risks of that sprinkle a day.
Have you had your sprinkle today?
When she got cancer, she did her own research and was shocked to find long-standing studies linking talc to ovarian cancer.
Why do you think it is that someone inside the medical industry wasn't even aware of this?
There really was nothing in the public at all about this. And even my gynecologist had never heard of that before.
Talc is the world's softest mineral and a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. It's used in plastics, antiperspirants, cosmetics, gum, medicine, soap, toothpaste, and baby powder.
From Johnson & Johnson, it's a feeling you never outgrow.
The debate over the safety of talc goes back decades. There's already a warning that it could cause breathing problems if inhaled. Dr. Daniel Kramer says there are other risks. A professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Harvard Medical School, he was first to find a statistical link between talc and ovarian cancer in a 1982 study.
It has taken 25 years of additional literature, I believe, to make the case. But I believe we were on target in that study, and that the subsequent studies have supported there is an elevated risk. We reported that the risk might be as high as twofold increase in risk if they had more than, say, 20 years of talc use.
Dr. Kramer testified as a paid expert in the trial of Dean Berg, who became the first ovarian cancer victim to sue America's #1 baby powder maker, Johnson & Johnson. Talc can get into women's reproductive tract, says Dr. Kramer, and trigger the cancer process, especially in long-term users like Berg, who says she sprinkled on powder every day for more than 30 years.
They took my pathology report and my slides with my tissue and did further research on it. And it came back definitely showing talcum in my ovaries.
Berg says Johnson & Johnson offered her $500,000 to avoid trial.
I didn't like the attitude of the people that were there from Johnson & Johnson. It was almost like a brush off.
Johnson & Johnson's chief financial officer called the new deal to pay $700 million an important step in putting the controversy behind it. Coming up next week on Full Measure, quite a turn of events on the U.S. southern border. A Biden border wall is being built.
If I remember correctly, President Biden did mention during his campaign that he was not going to build another foot of border wall, which he's not. He's actually building 17 miles.
We went to Rio Grande City, Texas to find where the new wall is going up and what folks think of it as the border rises to the top campaign issue in 2024 next week on Full Measure. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable. Thanks for watching. I'm Sharyl Attkisson.